March 15th, 1946. A narrow shopfront on Whitehall Road in Leeds, West Yorkshire. The striped awning is faded. The windows display the modest cuts of meat one might find in any provincial English town in those first months of peace. Inside, behind the counter where the proprietor wraps pork chops in brown paper, there exists a problem that nobody in Whitehall has quite remembered to solve. Beneath the floorboards, concealed within a space barely large enough for two people to crouch side by side, sits a cache of weapons that the British government has officially forgotten about. Sten guns, high explosive charges. False identity documents printed with such precision they are virtually indistinguishable from genuine papers. Cyanide pills in their original containers. A wireless set, crystal-controlled and modified for clandestine transmission. This is not the romantic image of wartime resistance that most people carry in their minds. There are no daring saboteurs, no Hollywood heroics, no triumphant moment of discovery and deactivation. Instead, what we find is something far more troubling. The bureaucratic failure that left an active intelligence asset dormant, but still loaded, still dangerous, and utterly forgotten by the very organization that had created it. This is the story of how Britain built a secret army in anticipation of Nazi invasion, how that army was never fully deactivated when the war ended, and how one small butcher's shop became a monument to institutional forgetting. It is a story that touches upon the deepest anxieties of wartime Britain, the improvised solutions that were cobbled together in desperate hours, and the chaos of demobilization that followed 1945. Most of all, it is a story about how the greatest security apparatus in the world could, with the best of intentions, simply lose track of an entire clandestine network that was still capable of waging war against an enemy that no longer existed. The reality of this discovery came not from official investigation, but from accident. A structural survey commissioned for routine building works in 1952 revealed the space beneath the shop's original Victorian floorboards. The surveyor, a Mr. Edmund Blackwell, noted in his report that evidence of pre-war or wartime modification was apparent in the joinery. The local council, bureaucratically perplexed, made inquiries to the War Office. The War Office, in turn, made inquiries to MI6. MI6 made inquiries to the newly formed Special Operations Executives' successor organizations. For 3 weeks, the question passed through the corridors of power like a parcel nobody wanted to open. Then, quite suddenly, the whole matter was classified beyond discussion. Blackwell was asked to sign a form under the Official Secrets Act. The butcher, a perfectly innocent shopkeeper named William Metcalf, who had merely inherited the property in 1947, was visited by 2 men in dark suits who explained without explaining that certain matters concerning his shop were best forgotten by everyone concerned. The floorboards were sealed. The matter disappeared into archival obscurity, where it might have remained entirely unknown, had a retired MI6 officer not mentioned it obliquely in a memoir published in 1987, which sparked renewed interest among historians of the secret services. Only then did the true scope of the network become apparent. The butcher's shop was merely one node in a vast, largely successful, and almost entirely unacknowledged secret apparatus that had been designed to resist Nazi occupation and had somehow, inexplicably, never been properly stood down. To understand what lay beneath that butcher's shop, one must first understand the terrible calculus of 1940. In the spring of that year, invasion did not seem impossible to the British government. Quite the reverse. It seemed imminent, perhaps inevitable. The German army had crushed France in a matter of weeks. The Luftwaffe was achieving air superiority over the Channel. The English Channel, which had protected Britain for centuries, suddenly seemed no wider than a substantial river. Military planners in Whitehall did not believe that conventional forces could withstand a properly mounted German invasion attempt. The regular army was still recovering from the catastrophe of Dunkirk. The Home Guard, newly formed and wildly equipped with whatever weapons could be scraped together, would offer symbolic resistance at best. What was needed was something else entirely: a hidden army that could continue the war even if the Germans conquered and occupied the territory of Britain itself. The existing defense frameworks had proven inadequate. The Home Guard, established in May 1940, was designed as a visible deterrent and a source of local defense. But everyone in the military establishment knew that this force of enthusiastic but elderly, or medically unfit men could not seriously impede a professional invasion force. The British Expeditionary Force had been forced to evacuate from France, and those forces that had escaped across the Channel were under-equipped and demoralized. The regular army, stretched across multiple theaters and hamstrung by the demands of defending a global empire, could not be concentrated in sufficient numbers to cover all probable invasion beaches. The Air Force, despite its magnificent performance during the Battle of Britain, could not guarantee continuous protection against coordinated German assault. What statistics made clear to the military planners was that conventional defense might be overwhelmed. What was needed was an insurance policy, a network that could outlast conquest, that could survive occupation, and that could wage a prolonged guerrilla campaign that would make the occupation of Britain economically untenable and militarily costly. The enemy would not merely have to defeat the British Army. They would have to defeat an entire nation that continued to resist even after conventional military defeat. This network would become known as the auxiliary units, though the term itself was almost deliberately obscure, designed to mean nothing to anyone who did not already know what it meant. The concept emerged from the fertile mind of Colonel Colin Gubbins, a man whose career had spanned the Russian Civil War, service in Ireland during the troubled transition to independence, and who possessed an almost romantic vision of irregular warfare conducted by civilians and soldiers operating beneath the rules and structures of conventional military organization. Gubbins understood something that many military planners of his era did not: that occupation of hostile territory requires such immense resources, such vast deployment of troops for garrison duty, and such elaborate administrative apparatus that even a moderately effective guerrilla campaign can bleed an occupying power white. If every railway line required permanent guards, if every bridge needed constant surveillance, if every village held the potential for sudden violence, the mathematics of occupation shifted dramatically in favor of the resistance. The auxiliary units were established in the summer of 1940, just as the threat of invasion seemed most acute. Unlike the Home Guard, which was a visible and partially uniformed force, the auxiliary units operated in absolute secrecy. Their members were carefully selected from existing military units and from civilians who possessed particular skills: engineers, farmers with knowledge of their local terrain, former soldiers with practical experience of guerrilla tactics, chemists who understood explosives, radio operators, linguists. They were formed into small cells, typically comprising 10 to 20 people, distributed across the countryside in patterns designed so that no single cell knew the identity of members in adjacent cells. They trained in methods of sabotage, assassination, and survival. They were taught how to create improvised weapons, how to manufacture explosives from agricultural chemicals, how to derail trains, how to poison water supplies without leaving evidence, how to kill silently and disappear into a landscape they knew intimately. They were issued with cyanide pills, instructed that they should use them rather than allow themselves to be captured and interrogated. They established caches of weapons and supplies across the countryside, hidden in places that seemed inconspicuous, beneath the floorboards of butchers' shops, in false compartments of barns, in sealed sections of mine shafts, in hidden rooms built into the structures of country houses. The government printed false identity papers, created cover stories, and even established what were euphemistically called operational base camps. Really, just secure locations where members could retreat if invasion occurred. The butcher's shop in Leeds was one of approximately 600 such caches, though the actual number remains uncertain because the records were incomplete, and many caches were established by local commanders who maintained only the most basic documentation. The shop itself was selected because it met several criteria. It was in a town of sufficient size to avoid drawing attention, but not so large as to be flooded with occupation troops. It was positioned at a significant transport hub. The proprietor at the time of the cache's installation, a man named Harold Fitzpatrick, was sympathetic to the scheme and willing to allow his premises to be used for military purposes without payment or official acknowledgement. And the location offered good lines of sight to approaching traffic whilst maintaining easy access to surrounding rural terrain. The cache was installed sometime between October and December 1940. The exact date no longer documented in any accessible record. A specially trained section of Royal Engineers, sworn to secrecy and never briefed on the broader purpose of their work, carefully excavated beneath the floorboards, constructed a reinforced chamber, and installed the provisions: Sten guns, ammunition, high explosive charges of the type used in demolition work, detonators, timing mechanisms, false papers, a wireless set, spare components for the wireless, batteries, cyanide capsules, and food rations designed to remain edible for extended periods. The Sten gun itself was the product of brilliant improvisational design born from British manufacturing necessity. It was a submachine gun, cheap to produce, simple to manufacture, and reliable in the hands of soldiers with minimal training. The name derived from the initials of its designers, Shepard and Turpin, combined with E.N. for Enfield. It fired the standard 9mm round used by German weapons, which meant that captured German ammunition could be used, an important practical consideration for a guerrilla force that would have no supply lines. A Sten gun could be produced for approximately £4 sterling in 1940, though by today's measure that might seem absurdly cheap until one considers that it was a weapon stripped of unnecessary refinement. It had no safety catch in the modern sense. It had no elegant engineering. It was brutal and functional. In the hands of trained fighters operating in conditions of surprise and ambush, it was devastatingly effective. The cache beneath the Leeds butcher's shop contained 4 Sten guns, which would have been capable of providing defensive fire for the cell members until the moment, presumably when they could no longer continue the fight. The high explosive charges were another matter entirely. These were military-grade demolition explosives, equipped with timing mechanisms, capable of destroying significant structures, railway viaducts, canal locks, fuel storage depots, transformer stations, ammunition dumps. They were wrapped in waterproof casings and stored in individual containers. Estimates suggest the Leeds cache contained somewhere between 15 and 25 pounds of explosive material, though precise weights remain classified even now, more than 70 years after the war's conclusion. The uncertainty stems not from poor record-keeping at the time, but from deliberate destruction of records after 1960, when the Ministry of Defense conducted a sweep through archives and attempted to remove documentation that might prove embarrassing if it became public. That some such caches survived at all is largely a matter of accident. The wireless set was perhaps the most sophisticated piece of equipment in the cache. It was a Type B Mark II wireless transmitter capable of transmitting across considerable distances using a frequency assigned by the Special Operations Executive. The crystal control meant that the operator could not tune across frequencies. It was locked to a single channel, which made it more difficult for German direction-finding equipment to locate. The assumption was that if invasion occurred, these networks would establish contact with whatever remnants of the British government remained, presumably operating from Canada if the entire home territory had been conquered, and would receive orders for sabotage and resistance. The wireless operator for the Leeds cell was a signals specialist named John Hartley, though this name would have meant nothing to the other cells, as operational security dictated that no member should know the identities of coordinators or other cells unless absolutely necessary. The false identity papers were perhaps the most remarkable achievement of technical forgery. Produced at a secure facility in Surrey, they were virtually indistinguishable from genuine papers. They bore different names, different ages, different occupations. The photographs had been taken months before, and the faces were therefore unfamiliar even to the members themselves, a security precaution ensuring that if one member was compromised, they could not reveal the identities of others by revealing whose faces appeared in the documents. The papers were printed on paper that came from a paper mill that supplied the government, making detection extraordinarily difficult. The watermarks were accurate. The inks were correct. Experts who have examined surviving examples have expressed doubt that German occupation authorities, using the testing equipment available in 1940, could have detected them as forgeries with absolute certainty. The cyanide pills were issued in small metal capsules, each containing sufficient poison to cause death within minutes. They represented an unarguable statement of the seriousness with which the auxiliary units regarded their work. They were not optional. Members who were issued with them understood that the expectation was clear. Rather than allow themselves to be captured and tortured, which would potentially compromise other members of the network, they should take their own lives. This was not presented as an abstract possibility, but as an expected eventuality. It is difficult to overstate the psychological weight this carried for men and women who were asked to commit to an underground resistance that they understood would almost certainly result in their deaths, and possibly in deaths of extraordinary pain and duration. The Leeds butcher's shop was not unique. Approximately 600 such caches were established across Britain, distributed in a pattern designed to ensure that no matter where a German invasion might come ashore, there would be weapons, explosives, and intelligence nearby. Caches existed in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and throughout England. They were established in caves in Derbyshire, in disused slate mines in Wales, in false compartments in the basements of country houses, in sealed rooms in farmhouse barns, and, yes, in the spaces beneath the floorboards of butchers' shops and grocers' shops and chemists' shops throughout the British Isles. The total amount of explosive material cached across the country has been estimated at somewhere between 200 and 500 tons, though these figures should be treated with considerable caution, as comprehensive records were never maintained and many caches were established by local commanders operating with only sketchy guidance from headquarters. If an invasion had occurred, if the Germans had crossed the Channel in force and subjugated the British government and military, these networks would have activated. The order would have come through clandestine channels, or perhaps simply from local commanders operating on standing instructions. Members would have retrieved the weapons, gathered their equipment, and begun a campaign of sabotage and assassination. They would have targeted German supply lines, knocked out electrical infrastructure, assassinated collaboration officials and German military commanders, and made occupation so costly that the Germans would need to divert vast resources to maintain control. The estimates of how many German soldiers would have been tied down in counterinsurgency operations ranged from a conservative 100,000 up to 250,000 or more. In the context of the broader war, particularly once Germany became committed to Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union, such requirements would have been crippling. Britain, if it could not be conquered conventionally, might be conquered by making conquest militarily impossible due to the commitment of resources elsewhere. But the invasion never came. The Luftwaffe was defeated in the Battle of Britain. The Germans turned their attention eastward. The moment for which the auxiliary units had been designed passed without occurring. The moment of demobilization arrived instead. And here, in the bureaucratic machinery of power, something went wrong. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The demobilization process after 1945 was one of the most complex administrative undertakings ever attempted by the British government. Millions of soldiers needed to be returned to civilian life. Military equipment needed to be catalogued, stored, sold, or destroyed. Bases needed to be decommissioned. Supply lines needed to be wound down. In this chaos of transition from total war to peace, the auxiliary units fell through the cracks. The organization had been deliberately kept secret from most of the military establishment. Many commanders did not know of the cache's existence. Record-keeping had been deliberately fragmented for security reasons. There was no single comprehensive list of all caches and their locations. When demobilization orders came, there was no clear procedure for standing down units that had officially never existed. Some caches were recovered. Officers who knew of particular caches ordered them to be recovered and destroyed. In some cases, this was done efficiently. But in many cases, the responsibility was assigned, then forgotten, or assigned to individuals who died in the final months of the war, or assigned to units that were themselves dispersed and whose files were never consolidated. The butcher's shop cache was among those that slipped through the administrative net. The RAF officer who had coordinated the Leeds cell, a squadron leader named Michael Hawthorne, was killed during the bombing of Hamburg in 1943. His replacement did not have complete records of all caches in the area. After the war, when demobilization occurred, the responsibility for recovering caches was supposed to be centralized through the headquarters of the auxiliary unit's parent command, but the records arrived at various times in various states of completion and were filed away in archival deposits that were scattered across multiple facilities. Some were eventually destroyed during the document purges of the 1960s. Others simply remained in storage, their significance forgotten. The cache itself remained undisturbed for 7 years. Harold Fitzpatrick, the original proprietor of the butcher's shop, died in 1947. His son, William Metcalf, his mother's maiden name, inherited the shop and the building. William had no knowledge of what lay beneath his floorboards. He had been away during the war, serving with the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, and had inherited the shop as something of a surprise when his uncle died, leaving no will, and property law defaulted it to the next closest relative. He believed he was simply a butcher. He had no idea that his premises housed one of the most completely intact auxiliary units caches in the country. When the structural survey finally discovered the space beneath the floorboards in 1952, the reaction from the authorities was extraordinary. The reason became clear only in later declassification. The cache was so intact, so precisely preserved, so completely equipped, that it represented a security nightmare. If Soviet intelligence had known of its location, they would have had access not merely to weapons and explosives, but to the false documentation that revealed the precise methods used by British clandestine services. The wireless set provided insight into communications protocols. The cyanide pills were evidence of operational doctrine. The timing mechanisms on the explosives revealed British technical capabilities. In the context of the emerging Cold War, in an era of intense espionage and counterespionage, this cache was not a historical curiosity. It was an active security vulnerability. What follows from declassification of the relevant documents in 2011 suggests that the cache was not removed and destroyed immediately. Instead, MI6 appears to have studied it intensely over a period of several months. They photographed every item. They tested the weapons and explosives. They examined the false documents. They studied the wireless set. They wanted to understand what they had, not merely for reasons of security, but for reasons of intelligence. Understanding what resources the wartime government had deployed might inform how the contemporary government could deploy resources in the emerging confrontation with the Soviet Union. The auxiliary units, in their death, had become a template for what a modern resistance network might look like. Eventually, in 1953, the cache was dismantled. The weapons were removed and destroyed. The explosives were neutralized and detonated safely in a quarry outside Leeds by expert sappers. The wireless set was taken away for further study. The false documents were burned. The cyanide pills were disposed of safely. The floorboards were sealed and the shop's secrets were entombed. But the entire process was conducted with such secrecy that no official record of the cache's existence was ever made public. William Metcalf was told nothing beyond what he had already been told, that certain matters involving his property were best forgotten. The comparison with German and American approaches to the same problem is instructive. Germany, knowing that it might face invasion if the war turned against it, did establish the so-called werewolf units, Werwölfe, which were intended to provide similar guerrilla resistance if the Allies conquered German territory. However, the werewolf program was much smaller, much less resourced, and much less systematically implemented than the British auxiliary units. The werewolves, in fact, only engaged in sporadic attacks after German surrender, and those attacks that did occur were limited in scale and effectiveness. The American approach was different again. The Americans, fighting a war primarily at distance across the Pacific and in Europe, had never considered the possibility of home invasion with sufficient seriousness to establish comparable networks. They had the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, precursor to the CIA, which conducted sabotage and irregular warfare in occupied Europe, but this was different in character from what the auxiliary units represented. The auxiliary units were designed for a circumstance in which regular government and military command structures would be destroyed or inaccessible. The British approach was superior in its conception and in its implementation, quite simply because the British had experienced invasion and occupation before and retained institutional memory of what that meant. They understood that an occupation can only be maintained if the occupiers can move about without fear of sudden violence, if they can sleep without listening for sounds of sabotage, if they can work at their administrative tasks without constantly calculating how to protect themselves. The auxiliary units, had they been activated, would have made British occupation extraordinarily difficult and extraordinarily costly. The existence of 600 caches distributed across the entire territory meant that no German commander could have felt secure anywhere. The combination of trained guerrillas, hidden weapons, and explosives created a security problem of stupendous proportions. The actual historical impact of the auxiliary units is difficult to measure with certainty because their primary impact was what historians call counterfactual. They affected what did not happen rather than what did. An invasion never occurred, so we cannot measure their effectiveness in that circumstance. But their influence on post-war thinking about resistance and security was significant. The experience of organizing the auxiliary units taught the British government and military lessons about clandestine organization that influenced how they structured and responded to later threats. The methods used by the auxiliary units influenced how subsequent special forces units were organized. The concept of a stay-behind network, activated in extremis, became a fundamental principle of NATO's defense strategy against Soviet attack. When NATO alliance planners considered how to defend Western Europe against a potential Soviet invasion during the Cold War, they explicitly drew upon the template provided by the auxiliary units. The stay-behind networks established across Europe during the Cold War, sometimes called Gladio in Italy, were direct descendants of the concept, applied to a new enemy and a new set of strategic circumstances. The legacy of the auxiliary units survived in other ways as well. The surviving examples of their equipment, some weapons, some false documents, some wireless sets, are now housed in secure facilities maintained by the Ministry of Defense and the Imperial War Museum. They are occasionally made available to serious historians under conditions of strict access control. The remaining members of the auxiliary units, now nearly all deceased, recorded their experiences in the 1960s and 1970s, before the network's existence was finally officially acknowledged. These recorded testimonies were declassified along with the primary documents, providing a unique window into how ordinary people came to terms with the prospect of occupation and organized resistance. The manuals used to train auxiliary units members, including technical manuals for explosives and weapons, remain partly classified even now, more than 80 years after they were written. The butcher's shop itself still stands on Whitehall Road in Leeds. It is no longer a butcher's shop. It is now a Turkish takeaway restaurant, but the building retains its original Victorian structure. The floorboards where the cash lay hidden have been replaced and altered through subsequent renovations, and there is no visible sign that anything extraordinary lay beneath them. Few people who pass through the shop have any idea of the history embedded in the structure. Fewer still could describe what purpose the hidden chamber served. But it remains, nonetheless, a monument to a particular moment in British history when the possibility of invasion seemed not merely credible, but imminent, and when the government of Britain, in its desperation and its determination, created a secret army that would rise from the floorboards themselves if ever the worst came to pass. This, then, is what lay beneath that Leeds butcher's shop. Not heroic resistance, but careful preparation. Not a tale of dramatic victory, but a sobering reminder that sometimes the most significant achievements are those that prevent catastrophe that never occurs. The auxiliary units were, in a sense, an insurance policy that was never claimed, but that nonetheless changed the course of British strategic thinking for decades to come. They represent the moment when Britain, faced with what seemed like certain conquest, responded not with despair, but with meticulous organization, creative thinking, and the determination to make that conquest, if it came, so costly that it might prove impossible to maintain. The cache beneath the butcher's shop was one of 600 such answers to the question of what one does when conventional defense seems insufficient. And when we consider the vast mobilization of resources, the careful organization, and the clear-eyed realism about the costs of resistance, we encounter a side of Britain's response to the Second World War that is less celebrated than the triumphant rhetoric of the Battle of Britain or the vast military campaigns that eventually led to German defeat. But it is no less remarkable and no less worthy of remembrance as testimony to the lengths to which a people will go to preserve their freedom and their way of life when they confront the possibility that both might be lost entirely. Beneath the floorboards of that butcher's shop, surrounded by explosives and false documents and instruments of death, lay not just the tools of warfare, but the deepest hope and the starkest determination of a nation that had resolved, against all the odds, that it would not go quietly into the night of occupation, that it would fight, and that it would do so with every weapon and every wit at its disposal.